What an incredibly, incredibly powerful movie. We have here our producer of the movie, Kathleen Kennedy, and Gloria Reuben. Now, Tony Kushner is on his way. He's late because the whole cast and Steven Spielberg and Tony were just having showed the movie to President Obama at the White House, and it's run a little bit late, and they had dinner, and Tony's on his way, and hopefully, if he gets here in a minute, he will tell us what that screening with the president was like, because apparently he was extraordinarily moved, I'm not surprised, by the movie. So, Kathleen, you know, there's so much to think about with regard to this movie, and tell us, having as the producer of it, I mean, just give us a little sense of what this project has taken. I mean, how many years? How did it come to be, and what were the steps you took to get it done?
Well, is it on? Sorry.
I hope everybody can hear.
Yep.
Yes?
Can you hear me?
You can hear, good now.
Can you hear me?
Hello? That we can hear you.
So, it has taken a long time. This all began when Steven was producing the Millennium Celebration in Washington, D.C. And Doris Kearns Goodwin was working on the Millennium Celebration and met Steven for the first time. And Steven very innocently said, "What are you working on next?" And she said, "I think I'm going to do a book on Lincoln." And he said, "I would love to make a movie about Lincoln." So the journey we embarked on almost 13 years ago was a discussion with Doris where we brought in a couple of different screenwriters. We tried to find an access point for what story we wanted to tell. And it was incredibly daunting. I mean, Doris hadn't written her book yet, and as everyone knows, there are endless books written on Lincoln. And so conversations ensued, and finally, while we were making the movie Munich, we fell into discussion with Tony Kushner. And Tony expressed interest in maybe trying to write a script. And the first script he wrote was 500 pages long. And Steven was, he was daunted, to say the least, because he didn't quite know what to do with Tony's tomb. So he began, again, a further discussion about how do we choose what part of Lincoln's life are we going to make a movie out of. And there was this small sliver of an idea that had to do with the passage of the 13th Amendment. And that's what Steven began to focus on. So about 6 years ago is when we finally said, this is the movie we want to make, and Tony began in earnest writing the screenplay, and eventually it became what you see on the screen.
Wow, because, you know, it's a very unconventional approach. I mean, there's so many extraordinary high points of Lincoln's life that to actually go in for this sliver was a very sort of bold, audacious, creative approach to it. Did you have disagreements amongst yourself about that? I mean, were you always in favor of that yourself, or did you see another movie in that when you read that 500
We saw many movies inside the first screenplay that Tony had written, but there was, you know, it's always interesting when you're trying to find an entry point for a film. You're looking, obviously, for a dramatic event, something that you can dramatize within cinematic language. And I think that's what Steven recognized so clearly, was that there was a real thriller, almost. It doesn't sound like it with the passage of the 13th Amendment, but that's what he recognized would be something he could seize upon and find the drama in.
And what was the biggest challenge as a producer of the movie?
I would say the casting. There's over 148 speaking parts in the movie, so it took us well over a year to cast everybody in the film.
Well, let's just talk to one of the very good pieces of casting sitting there. Gloria, of course, you're I mean, you have a very significant role, because although in terms of time, it's not a huge amount of time on the screen, nonetheless, you actually carry the whole sort of African American engagement in this movie. I mean, you are standing in a sense for so much more than just your character. So how did that feel for you as a...
Well, it's on now. Hello. Well, Elizabeth Keckley was a part of the White House, the Lincoln White House, from the beginning. She had, at that time, moved to Washington, D.C. about 4 months prior to the first inauguration and had met Mary Todd Lincoln. Elizabeth Keckley opened up her business here after having bought her own freedom, her and her son's own freedom in St. Louis. And so she was a part of the family. Having been a freed woman and a successful businesswoman, and also Mary Todd Lincoln's confidant and best friend and personal modiste, there was something extraordinarily powerful, I felt, emotionally powerful, to have Elizabeth Keckley be woven into the story in such a subtle way, but a poignant way. Her story with the president, her sharing with the president in the portico, her personal belief about where she stands as a woman in the country and as a kind of a sign, or not a sign, but kind of an example of so many others who had given the greatest gift of her son fighting for the Union. So I love the kind of specificity of that, the beautiful simplicity of that. It's all of these countless stories woven into this one woman's story, briefly, and somewhat silently, and yet
did you have to
really importantly.
When you were preparing for the part, you must have as well as have explored the character of Mary, because that she's
very
your
much
prime relationship. What did you learn about that relationship between Lincoln and Mary? I mean, she's a very sort of troubled character in the film.
Between President Lincoln and Mary, or between Elizabeth Keckley?
And between you and Mary too.
Oh, I learned a great deal. There are only a handful of books that really focused on the relationship between Elizabeth Keckley and Mary Todd Lincoln. A couple of authors, Jennifer Fleischner wrote a great book, as did Anne Rinaldi and Becky Rutberg. I had no idea, frankly, I'm embarrassed to say, I really had no idea about this relationship that these two women had until I think I may have jumped for joy after I found out that I was going to play her. So I read everything that I could and really discovered a couple of things. First of all, in order for Elizabeth Keckley to have, she was born into slavery, and her biological father was her master, and she was given away at 14 years old as a wedding gift to the eldest legitimate son. That's how they would, more often than not, keep the slave families as part of the legitimate family. And over the years, before she buys her freedom, builds up her own career as a dressmaker and designer, very gifted in the art of dressmaking. So in order for her to have walked those two worlds, but predominantly creating a long list of high society and political wives, as a client list, she had to, as equal to her building up the gift of dressmaking, she had to really kind of build up her gift of being an emotional, like the equanimous one. Do you know what I mean? She had a lot of experience with dealing with demanding, potentially emotionally volatile and highly intelligent Caucasian women. That's the only way that she'd be able to succeed. I guess that's funny, just a couple of people. But no. So by the time she gets to Washington, D.C., and she's in her late 30s, early 40s, and she meets Mary Todd Lincoln, she knows how to deal with that type of, again, highly intelligent.
How did she get into Mary Todd Lincoln's employ?
She is interviewed with a handful of 3 or 4, I believe, dressmakers, because Mary Todd Lincoln needs to hire a dressmaker because she's the new First Lady. And of course, she wanted to, as you see in the movie, she references that, you know, in that great scene where she tells Tommy Lee Jones's character, Thaddeus Stevens, that when they moved into the White House, she had to redo everything. They spent a lot of money because she didn't want to be seen as like a country bumpkin or what have you. And a lot of that had to deal with how she presented herself in the world. I believe that within the first 4 months of her being First Lady, Elizabeth Keckley designed and made, Elizabeth Keckley had seamstresses whom she hired, but she designed something like 21 gowns in the first 4 months. So, you know, again, imagine Mary Todd Lincoln. It's the beginning of the Civil War. People are dying, living in squalor, you know, yards from the White House. And she feels like she has to keep a certain kind of, you know, so that the nation's capital has this kind of elevated, very complicated, very complex, volatile woman. And Elizabeth knows how to kind of, you know, to the best of her ability.
How to handle it.
Yeah.
Kathleen, did you in the creation of this movie, did you talk a lot about how to portray Mary? I mean, was this a lot of discussion for you?
It was a long discussion. There's a wonderful biographer by the name of Kathleen Clinton, who also provided a great deal of background for us. But we cast Sally fairly early in the process, and Sally Fields became extremely involved in Mary's character and worked very closely with Daniel and with Stephen. We didn't do a huge amount of rehearsal, but she did spend a great deal of time talking with Kathleen Clinton and getting a real understanding of who she was.
And in terms of building, you know, this portrait of Lincoln, it is extraordinary, Daniel's performance, absolutely extraordinary. How did you coach him into this role? I mean, it was this all, you know, I know that he's a famous
First of all, I would never
student.
say that we coached him into anything.
Because he is so, I mean, you know, I know that he is just, he dives in and he just becomes this character, but what kind of tools did you bring to him?
It's, you know, it's interesting. Having never worked with Daniel before, he's very reluctant to talk about his process.